Bueno, es para nosotros un honor que haya venido el doctor Pasquale Striano a compartir esta jornada con nosotros, a pesar de que ayer había una huelga general de transportes en Italia y ha pasado gran parte de la jornada de ayer en el aeropuerto de Fiumicino esperando poder llegar y al final pues lo ha conseguido. Él es el jefe de epilepsia, de la unidad de epilepsia del famoso Instituto Gaslini de Génova. Como sabéis, es un hospital pediátrico monográfico, creo que es el más grande de Italia, de monográfico pediátrico, y está muy especializado en enfermedades, el instituto, en enfermedades sobre todo también metabólicas. Él ha formado parte también y forma parte de la comisión directiva de la Liga Italiana contra la Epilepsia, y sus áreas principales de interés, como sabéis, es la genética, sobre todo los proyectos actuales enfocados a la identificación de nuevos genes para trastornos del neurodesarrollo graves, y tiene un libro recientemente publicado con un título muy atractivo, Epilepsy over the Next Decade: New Trends and Hopes in Epileptology. Creo que es lo que todos tenemos en mente, y sin más, pues pasará.
Buenos días, muchas gracias por tu invitación al comité organizador. Yo estoy aprendiendo español por a par de meses, esta vez hablo inglés, la próxima vez español. Muchas gracias, Ángeles. So, I'd like to share some views of Genetic Commission of Italian League Against Epilepsy. In the last few years, there have been many advances in genetic testing in epilepsy patients, so it's time now to make the point, touch the base, and try to discuss which is the best examination in a specific patient. As you know, most of genetic epilepsy have a genetic background. It is estimated that at least 60% of all epilepsy have a genetic origin. Actually, this is clear in patients with genetic generalized epilepsy or idiopathic generalized epilepsy. As you know, there is a clear concordance degree between monozygous versus dizygosis twins. But on the other hand, most of common epilepsy have actually a complex inheritance. And this is a picture showing that in the last 2 decades, there have been many genes that have been associated with different forms of epilepsy. Many of these situations actually are ion channelopathies, and other diseases are connected with, like the case of LGO1 or syntaxin BP1 are actually synaptopathies. So many mechanisms are involved in genetic epilepsy, and this is a cartoon showing that basically mutation in proteins involved in the blood-brain barrier function, like LUT1 deficiency, and mutation in genes involve a presynaptic part of the neuron, and postsynaptic neuron actually may be the origin of different form of epilepsy. And this is also a helpful cartoon showing that the impact of different genes may be different based on the age of onset. That's the case of KCNQ2 and SCN2A mutation, which typically start within the first 3 months of life. On the other hand, mutation in other genes are widespread the infancy through the adult age, and mutation in other genes like epitempi and LGO1 are much more common in adolescence and adulthood. So this means that there is a period in which this epileptogenic mechanism during life. So this is the clinician perspective. So when should I think about genetic epilepsy? Clearly, it is very important to assess the clinical features of the epilepsy syndrome. And then you have to ask the family, the grandparents as well, about family history, the specific pattern and outcome of that epilepsy, the eventual involvement of other organs, congenital abnormalities, the presence of dysmorphisms, and that's very important, and neuroimaging abnormalities. And so it is very important to speed it up the genetic testing, especially when there is a therapeutic possibility. I will show some example later on. And eventually, for genetic testing is also important for genetic counseling purposes. So family history is very important. Make sure to have a 3-generation pedigree if available. It's very important to assess pregnancy and birth period, psychomotor development of the child, of the patient, the epilepsy feature, the pattern of seizure recurrence, the presence of comorbidities. And other neurological manifestations are very important. Let's take the case of paroxysmal dyskinesia, which may address you to mutation in PRRT2 gene. The presence of dysmorphisms is very important for to address genetic search for chromosomal rearrangement, the pattern of AG abnormalities, and neuroimaging or other organ involvement. This is basically the clinical scenario of the epileptologist. So based on this factor, you can have genetic generalized epilepsy, or still like idiopathic generalized epilepsy, non-lesional focal epilepsy, or epileptoencephalopathy. Otherwise, we can have an epilepsy in association with malformation cortical development. In other patients, you have progressive myoclonus epilepsy, and another possibility is an epilepsy with no specific electroclinical syndrome, but associated with intellectual disability, neurodevelopmental disorder, and dysmorphisms. Okay, which is the first step when you have a patient with an epileptoencephalopathy, or so-called developmental epileptoencephalopathy? You have to, first of all, you have to exclude a symptomatic origin, so metabolic dysfunction, vitamin deficiency, and then you have to assess which is the pattern of seizure recurrence, the G abnormalities, if there is a response or not to treatment, and eventually address the genetic testing, first of all, by use of next-generation sequencing, gene pan, target sequencing. Otherwise, you have to think about other genetic testing, like the case of chromosomal rearrangement with RACGH and eventually FISH. Electroclinical and clinical features are very important. Take the case of this girl with myoclonic seizure involving the face and with this crouch gait. These seizures are particularly precipitated by fever from age 6 months and starting after first vaccination. So you are thinking about Dravet syndrome, so it's very important to think about this syndrome and eventually address genetic testing. Take the case of this is another kid with this myoclonic atonic seizure starting during infancy, especially at morning and recurring during the day. So in this case, this patient has reduced cranial circumference and myoclonic atonic seizure with diffuse abnormalities, so you must think about GLUT1 deficiency. And this is another boy with focal seizure, mainly characterized by this autonomic seizure, staring, and is very pale, unresponsive. And in this infant, you have to think about SGN8A mutation, the Nova mutation. It's quite indicative. So this is our gene panel, a short version. There are only few genes, because actually in developmental epileptic encephalopathy, 80% of the patient are mutated only in a few genes. But nowadays, the use of clinical exome sequencing is becoming more and more frequent. So you must think about, even more important, is the fact that you should focus on the electroclinical features of the phenotype. And it is also important to remind that most of these mutations are actually de novo mutation, post-zygotic mutation. This means that you always have to consider sampling the parents to eventually check segregation of the finding from targeted sequencing. Okay. This is another situation, another scenario. Epilepsy associated with malformation cortical development. Sometimes you can have this periventricular nodular heterotopia. This is very common in females, adult females with focal seizure. You have to think, you should think about filamin A mutation or much rarer RGF2 mutation. In these cases, subcortical band heterotopia, LIS1 mutation, relin mutation are much more common. But what I mean is that neuroimaging here, together with electroclinical feature, is very important to, is the primary factor, main factor addressing genetic testing, as well the case of lissencephaly, this 8-shaped brain is typically associated with DCX-RX mutation. Okay, this is another scenario. Most of you will recognize this situation. This is a progressive myoclonus epilepsy with initial normal EG, then typically characterized by the appearance of diffuse abnormalities, paroxysmal abnormalities, and then myoclonic seizure, and brain of this girl will be characterized by diffuse continuous abnormalities. Jose Serratosa knows very well this situation is Lafora disease. So this is a progressive myoclonic epilepsy with cognitive decline. But on the other hand, we also have some form of progressive myoclonus epilepsy in which the cognitive function is relatively preserved at the beginning. That's the case of Humfering-Ludborg disease, which is a complete different mechanism of action with a mutation in cystatin B. It's an expansion of the gene, and you can have SCAR2 mutation, for instance. On the other hand, Lafora disease and neuronal ceroidal lipofuscinosis are associated with a much more evident cognitive decline in a few years from the onset. This is another situation. This is a patient, this is a girl with a focal seizure and tonic-clonic seizure, especially during sleep. But if you look to her phenotype, you look to typical dysmorphisms. With this pointed chin, she has constipation, Hirschsprung disease. In this patient, the clinical picture and the facial dysmorphisms are typically pointing to Mowat-Wilson disease. This may be caused by mutation in gene ZEB2, but this girl was negative. She did actually present a deletion of chromosome 2. So a RACGH should be the first choice when you have an aspecific epilepsy, so no typical electrocritical feature pointing to an epileptic syndrome in association with intellectual disability and dysmorphisms. So the first choice here is a RACGH. On the other hand, a RACGH is often associated with the recurrent copy number variant, and we know that there are several CNVs that may be associated with epilepsy, especially 15q13.3 deletion may be associated with a form of epilepsy similar to genetic generalized epilepsy. So, summarizing, we learn something from genetics of epilepsy, that mechanism of epileptogenesis are very heterogeneous. There is a genetic heterogeneity. That means that one phenotype, the same phenotype, may be associated with multiple genes, and vice versa. This means that one gene may be associated with multiple phenotypes. And there is a clear link between idiopathic epilepsy and developmental epileptic encephalopathy. So the type of a mutation, the segregation of the mutation is very important. And there is also an age dependency, a crosstalk between the mutation and developmental processes. In the clinical practice, this is our proposal from Italian League Against Epilepsy. If you have a defined an epilepsy syndrome like Dravet syndrome or early onset epileptic encephalopathy or TARA, think about a specific syndrome and target resequence. That means gene panel is the first choice. If negative, you can still think to a Sanger sequencing of a specific gene, even if this is in disuse. Then you have to switch to a RACGH and eventually to whole exome sequencing. If you have a patient with an undefined epilepsy syndrome, eventually associated with intellectual disability or dysmorphism, think about a RACGH. Eventually, you can think about karyotype, because a RACGH is not good to detect ring chromosome translocation, complex rearrangement. So karyotype still has a value in clinical practice. And then you have to think about gene panel and eventually to exome sequencing. So happy to discuss this approach. But still there are many challenges, because there is a large interfamiliar variability, and this is very important for genetic counseling. Which is the implication for treatment? So far, there are only few situations in which genetic testing may change the treatment. That's the case of, for instance, of GLUT1 deficiency. In this patient, you can start immediately ketogenic diet, which is very effective. On the other hand, in patient with mutation in mTOR pathway, you can consider rapamycin-sensitive mTOR drugs. This is nowadays time of precision medicine. This is a paper just appeared on New England, in which in a single patient with ceroidolipofuscinosis type 7 has been designed a specific oligosense antinucleotide, and the patient has been treated with good success. We are still far from in the clinical practice. The real world is this one, with nurses, EG technician, colleagues, the lab, and other groups, the people from the lab, with which is very important to interact to reach a diagnosis. And even more importantly, it is crucial to remark that most of epileptic encephalopathy and of genetic generalized epilepsy, as well as non-lesional focal epilepsy, are not being so far associated with mutation in any gene. So in the clinical practice, the global care, the maximization of quality of life, have long-term seizure control, and offering genetic counseling should be the main target of our approach. This is the website of parents of this patient. The parents of this girl did quit their job to make updated this blog, this website. This patient has actually a mutation in CDKL5, so a relatively frequent condition. Is not so challenging. But if you look to the final sentence of their blog, I think that the love of our beloved Serena and the faith science lead to a brighter future. This should be the message. So making a brilliant diagnosis is only the start of our job. Then we have to manage as well we can everything in the daily life of these patients. Thank you.